In the gray waters of the South Atlantic Ocean, far from the diplomatic conferences and political maneuvering that had failed to prevent the Second World War, the reality of naval warfare manifested itself in its most elemental form. On October 22, 1939, less than 2 months after hostilities commenced between Germany and Great Britain, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee intercepted and sank the British merchant ship SS Clement, a 5,000-ton freighter carrying cargo across one of the world's most vital maritime trade routes. This encounter, though involving vessels of vastly different purposes and capabilities, exemplified the strategic calculus that would define the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. The sinking of the Clement represented not merely the destruction of a single merchant vessel, but rather a deliberate component of Germany's strategy to strangle Britain's maritime lifelines, to sever the arteries of trade and supply that kept the island nation alive, and to demonstrate that German naval power could project itself across the world's oceans, despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Royal Navy. Understanding this single action requires examining the technology, strategy, personalities, and broader historical forces that brought these two ships together in the vastness of the Atlantic, where the outcome was never in doubt, but where the implications would echo through the war's opening months. The Admiral Graf Spee represented a unique solution to a strategic problem that had confronted German naval planners since the Treaty of Versailles imposed severe restrictions on German naval construction. Following World War I, the treaty limited Germany to ships displacing no more than 10,000 tons, a restriction designed to prevent the reconstruction of a German battle fleet that could challenge British naval supremacy. German naval architects responded to these restrictions with remarkable ingenuity, designing a new class of warship that would be designated as Panzerschiff, or armored ships, but which the world would come to know as pocket battleships. These vessels incorporated advanced design features, innovative construction techniques, and clever compromises to create ships that packed battleship-level armament onto a cruiser-sized hull. The goal was to create commerce raiders that could outfight any cruiser sent to hunt them, while possessing sufficient speed to escape from any battleship powerful enough to destroy them. The Admiral Graf Spee, named after the German admiral who had commanded the East Asia Squadron during World War I and who had perished at the Battle of the Falkland Islands in 1914, was laid down at the Reichsmarinewerft shipyard in Wilhelmshaven on October 1, 1932. The ship was launched on June 30, 1934, and commissioned into the Kriegsmarine on January 6, 1936. The vessel officially displaced 10,000 tons to conform to treaty limitations, though her actual displacement was closer to 12,000 tons standard and over 16,000 tons fully loaded, a deliberate violation of treaty restrictions that Germany felt increasingly comfortable ignoring as the 1930s progressed. The ship measured 186 meters in length with a beam of 21 meters. And drew approximately 7 meters of water when fully loaded. These dimensions made the Graf Spee substantially larger than a heavy cruiser, but smaller than a true battleship, a compromise that defined her entire design philosophy. The armament of the Admiral Graf Spee centered on 6 11-inch guns mounted in 2 triple turrets, one forward and one aft. These were formidable weapons, capable of firing a 670-pound armor-piercing shell to ranges exceeding 35,000 meters. The guns were mounted in turrets that provided 140 mm of armor protection on their faces, substantial enough to resist cruiser-caliber gunfire, but vulnerable to battleship weapons. The secondary armament consisted of 8 5.9-inch guns in single turrets, providing additional firepower against cruiser-sized opponents and useful for engaging merchant vessels at longer ranges. The anti-aircraft armament, though adequate by 1936 standards, would prove increasingly inadequate as the war progressed and air power became more decisive. The ship mounted 6 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, 8 37 mm automatic weapons, and 10 20 mm automatic cannon, The protection scheme of the Graf Spee reflected the compromises inherent in her design. The armor belt along the waterline measured between 60 mm and 100 mm thick, sufficient to defeat destroyer and light cruiser weapons, but penetrable by heavy cruiser guns at typical combat ranges. The deck armor ranged from 17 mm to 45 mm, providing protection against plunging fire at longer ranges but vulnerable to close-range engagement. The conning tower, from which the ship would be fought in combat, possessed armor up to 150 mm thick. This protection scheme meant that the Graf Spee could withstand punishment from light forces, but would be in serious danger if engaged by true capital ships. The philosophy behind this armor layout assumed that the ship would use her superior speed to avoid engagement with more powerful opponents, while her heavy guns would destroy any cruiser that attempted to close. The propulsion system of the Admiral Graf Spee represented one of the most innovative aspects of her design. Rather than using conventional steam turbines, which were standard for warships of this era, the Graf Spee employed diesel engines. 8-man diesel engines, arranged in 2 engine rooms, drove the ship's propellers through reduction gears. These engines developed a total of 54,000 shaft horsepower, giving the ship a top speed of approximately 28 knots, adequate for her intended role as a commerce raider. The revolutionary aspect of diesel propulsion lay not in speed but in range. Diesel engines consumed fuel far more efficiently than steam turbines, giving the Graf Spee an operational range exceeding 10,000 nautical miles at cruising speed. This extraordinary endurance meant the ship could operate for months in distant waters, without refueling, a critical capability for a commerce raider operating far from German bases. The ship carried approximately 2,500 tons of diesel fuel, stored in tanks distributed throughout the hull. This fuel capacity, combined with the efficiency of diesel propulsion, gave the Graf Spee a strategic reach that far exceeded conventional battleships or cruisers of comparable size. The crew of the Admiral Graf Spee numbered approximately 1,150 officers and men, a complement that included specialists in gunnery, engineering, navigation, communications, damage control, and all the other skills necessary to operate a complex warship. The commanding officer was Kapitän zur See Hans Langsdorff, a career naval officer who had served in the Imperial German Navy during World War I and had remained in service through the difficult years of the Weimar Republic and into the rebuilt Kriegsmarine of the Third Reich. Langsdorff was 45 years old in 1939, a professional officer with extensive experience in surface warfare. He was known as a humane commander who treated his crew fairly and who would demonstrate throughout the Graf Spee's operational career a concern for the welfare of merchant seamen that was unusual among commerce raiding commanders. This humanity would later complicate his tactical decisions and contribute to the ultimate fate of his ship. The strategic rationale for deploying the Admiral Graf Spee as a commerce raider in 1939 derived from Germany's recognition that she could not hope to match British naval strength in direct fleet engagement. The Royal Navy in 1939 possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers of capital ships, cruisers, and destroyers. Any attempt to fight a conventional naval war of fleet engagements would result in German defeat. However, German naval strategists recognized that Britain's strength was also her vulnerability. As an island nation dependent on maritime trade for food, raw materials, and fuel, Britain was extraordinarily vulnerable to attacks on her merchant shipping. If German surface raiders and submarines could sink merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced, Britain's economy would collapse, and her ability to wage war would be destroyed. This strategy of commerce warfare, or Handelskrieg, had nearly succeeded in bringing Britain to her knees during World War I through unrestricted submarine warfare. In 1939, Germany planned to employ both submarines and surface raiders in a coordinated campaign against British shipping. The deployment of the Graf Spee to the South Atlantic before the outbreak of war demonstrated German planning and foresight. The ship departed Wilhelmshaven on August 21, 1939, 11 days before Germany invaded Poland and 2 weeks before Britain and France declared war. This timing was not coincidental. German Naval Command recognized that once war began, the Royal Navy would establish patrols and surveillance networks that would make it extremely difficult for German surface raiders to break out into the Atlantic. By positioning the Graf Spee in operational waters before hostilities commenced, Germany ensured that her most powerful commerce raider would be in position to begin operations immediately upon the declaration of war. The ship was accompanied by the supply ship Altmark, a tanker that would provide fuel, provisions, and other supplies necessary for extended operations far from German bases. The mission orders given to Captain Zersi Langsdorff were explicit. He was to attack British and French merchant shipping in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, focusing on vessels carrying strategic cargoes. He was to avoid engagement with enemy warships, unless absolutely necessary, preserving his ship for continued commerce raiding operations. He was instructed to observe the regulations of international law regarding the treatment of merchant vessels and their crews, which required providing for the safety of survivors before sinking a ship. These regulations, established by various international conventions and treaties, represented an attempt to impose humanitarian restraints on naval warfare. They required that attacking vessels stop and search potential targets, verify their identity and cargo, provide opportunity for crews to abandon ship, and ensure the safety of survivors either by taking them aboard or ensuring they had adequate lifeboats and supplies to reach land. These requirements created significant tactical complications for commerce raiders, as they required approaching potential targets closely and spending considerable time in the vicinity of each sinking, time during which enemy warships might arrive. The SS Clement, the first victim of the Admiral Graf Spee's commerce raiding campaign, represented the type of vessel that kept Britain's maritime trade functioning. Built in 1934 by William Gray and Company in West Hartlepool, England, the Clement was a typical British tramp steamer of the interwar period. These vessels, called tramps because they did not operate on fixed routes, but rather carried cargo wherever it was available, formed the backbone of global maritime commerce. The Clement displaced approximately 5,000 gross registered tons, measured roughly 400 feet in length, and could make approximately 10 knots maximum speed. Her propulsion came from a single steam engine driving a single propeller, an arrangement that prioritized fuel efficiency and cargo capacity over speed. The ship could carry approximately 7,500 tons of cargo in her holds, and her shallow draft allowed her to enter ports that deeper draft vessels could not access. The crew of the SS Clement numbered approximately 40 men, a typical complement for a merchant vessel of her size. The master, the officer commanding the ship, held responsibility for navigation, cargo operations, and the safety of his vessel and crew. The chief engineer supervised the engine room crew, who maintained the ship's machinery. Deck officers supervised cargo operations and assisted with navigation. Able seamen handled lines, maintained equipment, and stood watches. The crew represented a cross-section of British merchant seamen, men who made their living carrying cargo across the world's oceans in peacetime, and who found themselves on the front lines of a new war they had done nothing to provoke. Unlike naval personnel who trained for combat, merchant seamen were civilians whose vessels happened to be carrying cargoes that military planners deemed strategically important. On October 22, 1939, the SS Clement was proceeding independently across the South Atlantic, bound from England to South America, or possibly returning from South America to England, the exact routing and cargo details being somewhat unclear in historical records. The ship was not part of a convoy, as the convoy system that would later become standard for protecting merchant shipping was not yet fully implemented in the South Atlantic. During the early months of the war, the Clement proceeded at her best speed, approximately 10 knots, following a route that balanced the shortest distance with considerations of weather, currents, and the need to avoid known danger areas. The crew maintained watches according to standard merchant marine practice, with lookouts scanning the horizon for other vessels, weather conditions, or any signs of danger. The encounter between the Admiral Graf Spee and the SS Clement occurred in the vastness of the South Atlantic, an ocean area where the distances between vessels could be hundreds or thousands of miles. The Graf Spee, possessing sophisticated radar and fire control systems by 1939 standards, detected the Clement at considerable range. German radar technology in 1939, while not as advanced as systems that would be developed later in the war, provided significant advantages in detecting surface contacts beyond visual range. The Graf Spee's radar could detect large surface targets at ranges exceeding 15 miles under favorable conditions, giving German commanders substantial warning of approaching vessels and allowing them to close for identification or avoid contact as tactical circumstances dictated. Upon detecting the radar contact, Langsdorff ordered his ship to close with the unknown vessel to determine her identity. The Graf Spee approached at high speed, her diesel engines driving the ship through the Atlantic swells at over 25 knots. As the range closed, German lookouts using powerful optical rangefinders and telescopes identified the contact as a merchant vessel proceeding independently. The silhouette rigging configuration and general appearance identified her as British, though positive identification required closer examination. Langsdorff ordered his crew to battle stations, a precaution in case the merchant vessel was armed or in case British warships were in the vicinity. The gun crews manned their weapons, fire control personnel took their positions in the directors and plotting rooms, and damage control parties stood ready throughout the ship. The SS Clement's crew became aware of the approaching warship as it closed to visual range. The appearance of any warship in the South Atlantic in October 1939 represented potential danger, as both British and German naval forces were operating in these waters and merchant vessels had no way to determine the nationality of an approaching warship until it came close enough for visual identification. The Clement's master, observing the approaching vessel through binoculars, would have noted her unfamiliar silhouette. British merchant seamen were familiar with the profiles of Royal Navy warships, and the Graf Spee's distinctive appearance, with her two main gun turrets and single funnel, did not match any British design. The realization that this was a German warship must have struck the Clement's crew with the force of a physical blow. They had no means of escape, no armament with which to defend themselves, and no options beyond hoping that the German commander would observe international law regarding the treatment of merchant vessels. The Admiral Graf Spee closed to within a few thousand yards of the SS Clement and signaled her to stop. International signal flags, hoisted to the Graf Spee's yardarms, conveyed the message in the universal code used by all maritime nations. The Clement's master, recognizing that resistance was futile and would only endanger his crew, ordered his engines stopped and the ship brought to a halt. German boarding parties prepared in advance for this contingency lowered boats and rowed across to the stopped merchant vessel. These boarding parties consisted of armed sailors who would search the ship for contraband cargo, verify her identity and destination, and assess whether she should be sunk or released. The regulations of commerce warfare in 1939 technically required that neutral vessels be released unless carrying contraband destined for enemy ports, while enemy vessels carrying strategic cargoes could be seized or destroyed. The German boarding party that clambered aboard the SS Clement conducted a thorough search of the vessel. They examined the ship's papers, which documented her registry, ownership, cargo, departure port, and destination. They inspected the cargo holds to verify what the ship was carrying. They checked for hidden weapons or suspicious materials that might indicate the vessel was something other than a simple merchant ship. The crew of the Clement, assembled on deck under German guard, waited anxiously while this examination proceeded. They understood that their ship's fate, and quite possibly their own lives, depended on decisions being made by German officers they had never met and over which they had no control. The examination confirmed that the SS Clement was a legitimate British merchant vessel carrying cargo that German authorities deemed strategically important to the British war effort. Under the laws of naval warfare as understood in 1939, this made the Clement a legitimate target for destruction. However, those same laws required that the German commander provide for the safety of the Clement's crew before sinking the vessel. Langsdorff, observing the humanitarian protocols he would consistently follow throughout the Graf Spee's raiding career, ordered the crew of the Clement to be taken aboard the German warship before their vessel was sunk. This decision reflected not merely legal requirements, but also Langsdorff's personal character and his understanding of the difference between military necessity and cruelty. The crew of the SS Clement, approximately 40 men, gathered their personal belongings and any portable items of value before abandoning their ship. They were transported by boat to the Admiral Graf Spee and brought aboard the German warship. For these merchant seamen, stepping onto the deck of the enemy warship that would destroy their vessel must have been a surreal and frightening experience. They were now prisoners of war, subject to German authority, separated from their ship, and uncertain of their ultimate fate. Langsdorff, however, ordered that the British prisoners be treated with dignity and provided with adequate quarters and provisions. This humane treatment of captives would characterize the Graf Spee's entire raiding campaign and would later earn Langsdorff the respect even of his enemies. With the crew of the SS Clement safely removed, Langsdorff faced the decision of how to sink the merchant vessel. Several options were available. The ship could be sunk by gunfire, using the Graf Spee's secondary armament to hold the hull below the waterline until she foundered. This method was certain, but time-consuming and expended ammunition that might be needed for future engagements. Alternatively, the ship could be sunk by scuttling charges, explosives placed aboard the vessel by German boarding parties, and detonated to blow holes in the hull. This method was efficient but required sending boarding parties back aboard the merchant vessel, consuming time and exposing German sailors to potential hazards. Finally, the ship could be sunk by torpedo. Though this seemed wasteful of expensive weapons against an already stopped and defenseless target, Langsdorff chose to sink the SS Clement by gunfire, a decision that balanced efficiency with conservation of specialized weapons like torpedoes. German gun crews, well trained in the operation of their weapons, opened fire on the stopped merchant vessel from ranges of only a few thousand yards. The 5.9-inch secondary guns, more than adequate for destroying an unarmored merchant ship, fired high explosive shells that tore through the Clement's thin hull plating. Each shell that struck created massive damage, blowing holes in the hull, starting fires, destroying machinery, and progressively reducing the vessel to a sinking wreck. The Clement, her hull ruptured in multiple places, began taking on water. The sea poured through the shell holes, flooding compartments, and dragging the ship down by the bow. Within a relatively short time, perhaps 30 minutes to an hour, the accumulated damage and flooding overwhelmed the ship's buoyancy. The SS Clement settled lower in the water, her bow dipping beneath the surface, her stern rising into the air as the forward compartments flooded completely. Finally, with a final lurch, the ship slid beneath the waves and disappeared, leaving only debris, oil slicks, and a patch of disturbed water to mark where she had been. The sinking of the SS Clement represented a tactical success for the Admiral Graf Spee's commerce raiding mission. A British merchant vessel of 5,000 tons had been removed from service, her cargo lost, her contribution to Britain's war effort terminated. The broader strategic impact of this single sinking, however, must be understood in context. The destruction of one 5,000-ton merchant vessel would have negligible effect on Britain's overall merchant marine capacity. Britain possessed thousands of merchant ships totaling millions of tons of carrying capacity. The loss of the Clement would barely register in the statistics of British maritime commerce. However, the cumulative effect of many such sinkings, conducted by multiple German raiders and submarines operating simultaneously across all the world's oceans, could potentially inflict crippling damage on British trade. This was the strategic calculation that underlay Germany's commerce warfare campaign. The psychological impact of the Clement's sinking extended beyond simple tonnage calculations. Each reported sinking of a British merchant vessel reminded the British public and government that German naval forces were operating freely in waters the Royal Navy supposedly controlled. Each sinking damaged British prestige and raised questions about the Royal Navy's ability to protect British commerce. Each sinking created anxiety among merchant seamen who understood that they might be the next victims. The German strategy of commerce warfare aimed not merely to sink ships but to create a climate of fear and uncertainty that would disrupt British trade beyond the actual physical losses inflicted. For Captain Sir C. Langsdorff and the crew of the Admiral Graf Spee, the sinking of the Clement marked the beginning of what would be a remarkably successful commerce raiding cruise. Over the following weeks, the Graf Spee would sink additional British merchant vessels in both the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, ranging as far as the approaches to Madagascar before returning to the South Atlantic. The ship's diesel propulsion, which allowed extended operations without refueling, proved its worth as the Graf Spee covered thousands of miles without returning to base. The supply ship Altmark periodically rendezvoused with the raider to transfer fuel, provisions, and captured crew members, allowing the Graf Spee to remain at sea indefinitely. The Royal Navy's response to the Graf Spee's depredations demonstrated both the challenges of hunting commerce raiders in the vast expanses of the world's oceans and the determination with which Britain would prosecute the naval war. As reports of merchant ship sinkings reached the Admiralty in London, British naval intelligence analysts attempted to track the raider's movements and predict her future positions. This proved extraordinarily difficult given the limited information available and the vast areas in which the raider might operate. The Royal Navy organized hunting groups, formations of cruisers and smaller warships, tasked with searching specific ocean areas for the German raider. These hunting groups consumed enormous resources, tying down multiple warships in potentially fruitless searches, while the raider might be operating in completely different areas. The fate of the Admiral Graf Spee would ultimately be sealed not by these hunting groups, but by a combination of tactical decisions, communication intercepts, and a battle fought off the coast of Uruguay in December 1939. The Battle of the River Plate, in which the Graf Spee engaged 3 British cruisers and was damaged sufficiently to seek refuge in neutral Montevideo, marked the end of the pocket battleship's raiding career. The subsequent scuttling of the Graf Spee by Langsdorff's order, conducted to prevent the ship from falling into British hands after political maneuvering prevented her from making repairs or breaking out to sea, represented a dramatic conclusion to one of the most successful commerce raiding operations of the early war period. Langsdorff himself, devastated by the loss of his ship and the deaths of crew members during the Battle of the River Plate, committed suicide shortly after the scuttling, a tragic end for a humane and professional naval officer. The sinking of the SS Clement on October 22, 1939, viewed from the perspective of subsequent events, represents both the promise and the limitations of Germany's commerce raiding strategy. The Graf Spee demonstrated that German surface raiders could indeed operate successfully in distant waters, sinking merchant vessels and disrupting British trade. However, the operation also revealed the fundamental problem facing German commerce warfare. Individual successes, even accumulating to significant tonnage sunk, could not overcome British numerical superiority and industrial capacity. Britain could replace merchant ship losses through new construction and the requisitioning of neutral vessels faster than German raiders could sink them. The commitment of major warships like the Graf Spee to commerce raiding operations, while tactically effective, represented a poor return on investment when those same ships might have been employed in fleet operations or other strategic roles. The crew members of the SS Clement, taken aboard the Graf Spee as prisoners, eventually found themselves transferred to the supply ship Altmark along with prisoners from other sunken merchant vessels. They remained aboard the Altmark through the Graf Spee's operational cruise and even after the pocket battleship scuttling. The prisoners' ordeal would end only in February 1940 when the British destroyer Cossack, acting on intelligence about the Altmark's position, intercepted the supply ship in Norwegian territorial waters and forcibly rescued the imprisoned merchant seamen. This rescue operation, while technically violating Norwegian neutrality, provided a morale-boosting success for Britain and returned the Clement's crew to their homes after months of captivity. The strategic lessons learned from the Graf Spee's commerce raiding campaign influenced naval operations throughout World War II. The experience demonstrated the vulnerability of independent merchant ships to surface raiders and accelerated the implementation of the convoy system in the South Atlantic and other theaters. Convoys in which multiple merchant ships traveled together under the protection of naval escorts proved far more defensible than individual ships proceeding independently. The convoy system dramatically reduced shipping losses to surface raiders, though it came at the cost of reduced efficiency and longer voyage times. The experience also validated the German emphasis on submarine warfare as the primary means of attacking British commerce. Submarines, being harder to detect and engage than surface raiders, proved more survivable and more cost-effective as commerce warfare platforms. The sinking of the SS Clement, while a minor incident in the vast scope of World War II, encapsulates many of the essential characteristics of naval warfare during the conflict. It demonstrates the vulnerability of merchant shipping to military action, the humanitarian complications of warfare at sea, the challenges of operating naval forces in vast ocean areas, and the ultimately decisive nature of industrial capacity and resource availability in modern war. The crew members who died, those who survived as prisoners, and those who eventually returned to service all contributed to the maritime war effort that sustained Britain through her darkest hours and ultimately enabled the Allied victory.